Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope that you're doing well this afternoon, this evening. I'm doing pretty good. If you're like me, you're very busy and doing a lot of stuff right now. You're probably writing papers and preparing for exams. Here in a moment, before we get started, I will talk a little bit about the extra credit assignment and how that will work. Before we get started, um, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for a great semester. It's been such a good experience, and we've had so many good discussions that I always leave them thinking about what it would be like to do this in person and like get to know you and learn more about you. And it's sometimes surprising how you are brought back to reality and you remember that behind the screen there are actual people, and of course you're real people. I've read your writing and graded your work, but when we have discussions, there's always something that comes out that gets lost in translation when I'm just kind of lecturing or looking at the screen. So I just want to thank you for being a part of it, and I'd imagine that many of you took this course because it was interesting to you, and that's why I teach the course too. So I think that's what brought us together, and we learned a lot from each other. So though this is sort of the beginning of the end, I think it's really just the start of what's been a really good experience, hopefully for you and for me as well. So um, it's kind of interesting as we come down to the end of the semester. I'm actually completing some work of my own. I'm facing a deadline of tomorrow to submit a revision of an article that was accepted pending a revision at a good journal in comparative politics. And the paper compares Argentina and Chile, and it's a paper on defense industry reform. So working on it and writing about those topics makes me think of this class. And so it's been a good experience, and I've been working on similar topics as well, and so we've been doing this sort of alongside one another, so to speak. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's go ahead and begin to talk about the extra credit assignment that I'll give you on Friday. So what I've decided to do is give you a full week to complete the assignment if you choose to do it. It's optional. But if you choose to do it, it will be sort of like a final exam of sorts, similar in content to the midterm. You'll have some concepts for definition and then one or more essay prompts. And I'll make a decision about how many of those prompts I'd like to give you. Most likely, I'll just give you one. But this is going to be extra credit. And what I decided to do is to give you the option of getting back 20 additional points on the long paper. So what that means then is I'll grade your paper, but then if you choose to do the extra credit assignment, you can potentially get 20 extra credit points on your long paper. And because the long paper is going to be one of the single biggest components, that will really support you nicely and complement your grade. Now, you'll need to, of course, complete the extra credit assignment, and I'll grade it just like I would if it wasn't extra credit. But you can potentially get back 20 points. And so I'll add that to your paper grade should you get those points or however many you get. And so the way it'll work then is you'll get back extra credit on your paper grade, and then that will go into the calculation of the ultimate grade. I really encourage you to do this. This is a chance for you to get points that frankly, if things had gone to plan and the university had created a time slot for a final exam, it would have been required that you complete a final exam. And so this has been frustrating for me, but I think that it can be really nice and beneficial for you. And I hope that you'll take the opportunity to do the extra credit. Now, that being said, I'm aware that you're very busy and you're also writing a paper for this class too. So keeping that in mind, there may be some limits on your time, and I'm well aware that some of you just might not have time to do it. But I'm also thinking about that, and I want to create an assignment that is reasonable to complete in a time frame that is relevant for you. So I keep that in mind, and if you have any comments or questions about any of this, I will go ahead and take those now. I think that one of those questions might be, when are you going to create a submission slot for the final paper? I will do that later tonight, tomorrow at the latest. I'd like you to take all the time that you have available to you to complete your paper. And so don't rush to submit that, because you might decide at the last minute that you want to change something. But are there any comments or questions about any of the above?
How many points is the final paper out of?
So it's just going to be out of 100 points, like anything else. It's just that I'm forgetting what the percentage of the overall grade is for the paper, but it's a larger share than the research design paper. So it'll be out of 100 points. But say you get a 92 or a 93 on the paper. If you get an 18 or a 19 out of 20 on the extra credit assignment, I would add that 18 or 19 points to that 92 or 93 out of 100. And so hypothetically, say you got 18 extra credit points and you got a 92 out of 100 on the paper. So hypothetically, theoretically, you would get 110% on the long paper. And so that's how that would work. And so getting extra credit on that long paper will bring up the rest of your grade if you were less satisfied with your midterm or your research design paper.
Do we have to finish all the extra credit? So like, let's just say I just want to do the definition parts and not do the essay. Can I do that and still get the points I would earn from the questions I answered?
I mean, yeah, you could, certainly. I think that there's like some heuristic value to completing the whole thing, because you're so close, just go a little further, right? But yeah, if you decide, or if you're limited and you don't have the time or the energy or the space to do the whole thing, just do what you can. Something is always better than nothing. Other comments or questions about any of the above?
So for the final, are you just gonna upload a PDF that we write on, similar to how you did with the midterm exam?
Yeah, it'll work the same way as the midterm. So you'll find it under files, and then there'll be an assignment slot or a submission slot under assignments on CAD courses. So just find the file under files, and then I'll also post it under the assignment under the assignments tab. But what we discovered was that not everyone can access it through that assignments tab, so I'll make sure that it's available in files as well. Deliner says 200 extra points. It is really close to Christmas. Well, I am feeling extra jolly. Yeah, so the research paper is about 35%. So what I'm going to do is just scale everything up to round out the grade, since we don't have the final. No, it's not during lecture hours only, Zeri. You can spend a full week doing it. So I'll post it on Friday, and I'm going to give you until the following Friday to complete it. And so, theoretically, you shouldn't need more than an hour and 15 minutes, or even an hour and a half to complete it, because it's going to be relatively short. But you can spend that time whenever you choose to complete the exam. Now, that being said, make sure that you discipline yourself. Sometimes flexibility can be a double-edged sword. It can be harder to get stuff done. But I'm willing to take that risk because I know that we're under a lot of difficult circumstances. So complete that sometime during that week and then just submit it when you're done. Yes, you can email it to me always. And that's fine. Sometimes students are completing exams on their phone or on something that's different than a computer, and sometimes email is what works best for them. So yeah, you can use whatever works for you. Just make sure that I get it, and that's all that counts. Okay, everybody, so let's get back into this topic of US Latin American relations. So far, what we've been doing is sort of tracking like the changes from time period to time period. And we left off sort of right before World War II. And we find Latin America and the United States increasingly cooperating, and especially the United States sort of reaching out, establishing friendly relations, pursuing a cooperative friendship with lots of Latin American countries because they discovered that the previous policies failed. They were very costly morally and ethically and economically and politically. They also discovered that World War II was imminent, and so it was important to establish friendly relationships with Latin American countries to keep them neutral so that they didn't side with the aggressor during the future conflict. So in general, there was an important change. And by 1942, most of Latin America had actually declared war on the Axis powers. So they'd gone further than just neutrality and really joined the United States in positioning themselves against the Axis powers. And in 1942, the Rio Conference resulted in the Inter-American Defense Board, which was basically this cooperative framework for military leaders in Latin American and North American countries to come together and coordinate plans and establish strategies for defending the hemisphere. So this was an important institution because it symbolized cooperation between the Americas, and it further increased cooperation. And so although we often have a very critical view of the United States' role in Latin America, it's often been more nuanced under the surface. For instance, economic integration and the expansion of Latin American economies had a lot to do with relationships with the United States, and the US is a large market itself. The establishment of cooperative relations during World War II was also important because it meant that relationships between Latin American countries were strengthened and relationships with the United States were strengthened. And these became eventually important to further cooperative endeavors. Now, some of those we'll see became very problematic and gruesome, especially during the Cold War. But eventually, the Cold War would pass, and many of these enduring relationships would become more favorable, again, at least from the point of view of maybe the promotion of democracy over authoritarianism in Latin America. So I'd like to encourage you to keep an open mind and be open to the possibility that the US role in Latin America has often been more complicated than any single narrative would depict. Now, the Cold War is a period that does reinforce a lot of our very negative views of the US role in Latin America. So let's be honest and assess it for what it was. Cold War inter-American relations were fundamentally about containing what was viewed as a communist threat and responding aggressively to social and political pressures that were viewed as a threat to US influence, to capitalism, and to stability in the region. And so for the same reasons that the US sought to establish a neutral Latin America during World War II, they also tried to tamp down on unrest and social and political pressures in the post-war period, the Cold War period. The Truman Doctrine in 1947, or the policy of containment, is one iconic policy from this period that makes us think about the US effort to suppress these pressures and the potential communist threat in Latin America. And the Rio Treaty of 1947 became another important touchstone because it established the responsibility of different countries in the Americas to one another. And basically it said that they had a responsibility to defend each other should any of them come under attack by some foreign adversary. And so this image here from late in World War II is sort of indicative of the Rio Treaty and the turn towards reciprocal assistance between American countries. And when I say American countries, I mean countries in the Americas. The Truman Doctrine was designed first and foremost to legitimate intervention and create a foundation, a basis, a justification for intervening to suppress uprisings that might threaten stability or threaten US interests. That's what it was. And Truman himself said in 1947, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And the Truman Doctrine essentially committed the United States to assisting quote unquote free peoples against internal foes who sought radical change. And the issue with the Truman Doctrine became that it was so broadly applicable to any kind of unrest that it was used to justify interventions that were mainly motivated by a need to defend US interests against democratic forces and democratic movements in Latin American countries. The policy of containment in the Truman Doctrine set off a historical period that would become synonymous with US intervention and support for military regimes, CIA-backed coups, repression, brutal, merciless clampdowns on unrest. In general, it really ushered back in the bloodier aspects of US involvement in the region. And it really took a step back in time. Whereas the good neighbor policy seemed to represent a step forward in friendlier relations, the policy of containment in the sort of Cold War hysteria really represented a step backwards, since it helped to validate repression and prop up authoritarian regimes. The main issue during the Cold War was that the US had a number of competing interests, all of which were under threat. So first of all, the US had to maintain economic interests that were invested in Latin American countries. So US business opportunities in business ventures that had gone abroad and invested in these places. The United States became very fearful about expropriation or the seizure of these assets and interests by Latin American governments that veered too far left. The US also was concerned about military dominance by any Latin American country. The idea was, as we simultaneously prop up militaries and support their repression, we have to also prevent their dominating any single Latin American country. They can't become too powerful, any single Latin American country, militarily or politically or economically. The United States had multiple objectives then. At the same time, they were also trying to win the hearts and minds of Latin American leaders and people, because it was essential to prevent them from embracing communism and dispensing with capitalism, which would have altered the balance of sort of economic influence in the region and created a situation hostile to US interests and capitalism in the region. And so in 1948, the United States helped to create the Organization of American States, which was designed to promote hemispheric solidarity and really more generally kind of create lines of communication and cooperation between the countries that could maybe prevent them from veering off course. And really the big impact of the Cold War was that containment and support for authoritarian regimes when it was necessary to preserve capitalism took precedence. For the United States, that is. Latin American countries went a variety of different ways, and as we'll see, they were often met with US resistance. But for the United States, it was all about containment and preventing that occurrence. We'll see in a moment how they went about doing that. But there's obviously some latent contradiction in this policy of containment and in this set of responses to the Cold War in Latin America. So there's obviously the collective interest, promoting democracy, but there's also the interest in containment and the interest in preventing the rise of regimes that might be supported by the popular majority but hostile to US interests. So the central goal of US foreign policy increasingly became strengthening anti-communist regimes. The sole focus became combating the communist threat or the perceived communist threat. In a sense, US Latin American relations had returned to that original dollar diplomacy that characterized US interference in the region in the 19th century. And in this period of hysteria, this kind of extension of the Red Scare to Latin America and this emphasis on strengthening anti-communist regimes, the militaries became especially important. The militaries were viewed by the CIA and the US security establishment as the entities that had the capacity in these countries to preserve order and to use the power of the state to fight off the communist threat and to suppress those leftist uprisings that so threatened US interests. The militaries in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Uruguay, throughout the region became critical in this policy. And so the US began to support military regimes to stop the spread of communism. And it was a difficult choice, but it was one that also exposed the trade-offs in the conflicts inherent in US foreign policy. And so it's well known that Latin America has been meddled in by the United States on countless occasions. And I found this useful graphic which highlights all the instances of successful US-backed regime change in Latin America since 1898. 1898 saw the very first interventions in Cuba and shortly after Nicaragua. But since 1898, there have been 17 direct US interventions and 24 indirect US interventions. This does not include those attempted interventions that failed, and there were many of those as well. But as you can see, most countries in the region had these, with some exceptions. Obviously, in countries like Argentina, as well as Uruguay, the militaries acted more autonomously, as can be seen here. In Ecuador as well, the military acted autonomously. But in countries like Chile, Brazil, Bolivia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, the United States backed regime change efforts as part of this larger campaign to combat communism or the perceived threat of communism. And all of these instances represents a unique historical episode that had a context and that had domestic and international actors. And what I would encourage you to do is to not assume that though the US was involved in these, it was entirely a product of US influence. Even in Chile in 1973, one of the best known examples of US meddling in Latin America, they were powerful domestic actors who exerted their own influence and acted of their own accord to steer the outcome as well, and to bring about the coup as well. And so the Chilean military in that case, as we'll see, also had skin in the game. But the United States has been a player in Latin America when it comes to efforts to change the regime and more generally intervention in the region. Now, this is a good opportunity for us to pause and take a look at a brief history of the US-backed dirty wars in Central America in the 1970s and 1980s. These dirty wars were basically campaigns carried out by security forces to round up and kill or disappear suspected opponents of the military regime and suspected leftists or guerrillas, often in Central America. And these dirty wars were brutal, merciless affairs that oftentimes resulted in huge numbers of deaths of innocent people who were never implicated in any violence and who were only minimally linked to any leftist insurgency or guerrilla group. But the United States backed and supported these dirty wars. These dirty wars are not just distant memories. They actually set the stage for the refugee crisis that continues to this day. That refugee crisis is a result of the violence and insecurity in many Central American countries. That violence and insecurity in this environment of instability is itself a product of the periods of military rule, when the violence carried out by the state resulted in equally as much violence in the society, and the transitions to democracy never actually resolved those fundamental underlying issues. And so the violence that gives way to the refugee crisis needs to be understood as intimately linked to the US campaign to support dirty wars and the disappearance of leftist activists in the 1970s and 80s in Central America. So let's watch this video and get a sense of it.
The world watched in horror as U.S. Border Patrol agents opened fire with tear gas on a group of refugees seeking asylum in the United States. These agents fired rounds across the border into Mexico. Donald Trump claims that many of these refugees are hardened criminals.
I didn't say in all cases, but in many cases, these are hardened criminals. These are tough people.
But as with many things that come out of Trump's mouth, he offered no facts to back it up. He just uses the most powerful podium in the world, that of the American president, to slander masses of suffering people looking for refuge. Among the targets of this assault by US forces were women and children, many of whom had fled Honduras. Across the news media, these refugees are simply referred to as migrants or the caravan. Rarely do we get any context of why they are risking their lives and the lives of their children to flee Honduras. And part of why you don't hear this context is because to really tell this story, you need to talk about the US dirty wars in Central America in the 1980s, the impact of neoliberal economic policies, the catastrophe of climate change caused by the US and other major world powers. You need to know history.
I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests. I helped in raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies.
And if you know this history, particularly in Honduras, then you know that what we are seeing now is a situation where the US set a house on fire, and as the flames have raged, the US is standing against the people trying to flee the fire that Washington set to their homes.
My fellow Americans, I must speak to you tonight about a mounting danger in Central America that threatens the security of the United States.
Throughout the 1980s, the Reagan administration waged a series of dirty wars throughout Central America. After the leftist Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua, the US began a program to support a death squad known as the Contras. Neighboring Honduras, which was technically a newly democratic state, was in reality ruled by a right-wing military junta. The forces under General Gustavo Alvarez operated a notorious CIA-backed death squad in Honduras known as Battalion 316. Thousands of people were killed during this period in the name of fighting communism.
You can't have communists running free all over the place doing what they want to do. What happens if the United States get attacked by communists, or we leave it open to be attacked by communists? What happens then?
Honduras was the staging ground for U.S. support for the Contras, and the point man for the Reagan administration was Ambassador John Negroponte. Now, Negroponte cut his teeth working for Henry Kissinger during the Vietnam War. As ambassador to Honduras from 1981 to 1985, Negroponte presided over the second largest embassy in Latin America at the time, and the largest CIA station in the world. From that post, Negroponte not only coordinated Washington's covert support for the Contra death squads and the Honduran junta, but he also covered up the crimes of its murderous Battalion 316. Negroponte's predecessor in Honduras, Ambassador Jack Binns, told the New York Times that Negroponte had discouraged reporting to Washington of abductions, torture, and killings by notorious Honduran military units, saying, quote, "I think Negroponte was complicit in abuses. I think he tried to put the lid on reporting abuses, and I think he was untruthful to Congress about those activities."
My first awareness of the existence of the battalion by that name, and we can get into this because I'm not trying to be fancy with my use of words here now, but
John Negroponte was asked about the death squad in front of the Senate in 2001 during his confirmation hearing for UN ambassador.
I asked the CIA about Battalion 316 and was given a memorandum by the agency at that time. To the best of the agency's knowledge at that time, there had been no substantiation of any human rights, systemic human rights violations being carried out by that unit.
Among the crimes committed by US-backed Honduran forces during Negroponte's tenure was the murder of a US Jesuit priest named Father James Guadalupe Carney. Father Carney was a liberation theology revolutionary who spent 18 years with the campesinos and living among the poor of Honduras. The US-backed forces waged a smear campaign against Father Carney, who was a World War II veteran, claiming that he was a communist.
When a valley like this could produce enough food, they say, for all Central America, is producing vegetable oil for Castle and Cook Company. I mean, that's a terrible crime. It's a sin. And that's why we Christians nowadays in Latin America, we want to change that. We rebel against that. Even if they call us communists, even if they kill us, we have to try to do something about it.
In 1983, Father Carney was murdered by a US-backed death squad. We still do not know the truth of what exactly happened to him, but there are many sources who say he was captured alive, tortured, and then thrown from a helicopter into the jungle.
In a letter to The Economist in 1982, then Ambassador Negroponte wrote, and I quote, "It is simply untrue that death squads have made appearances in Honduras. And yet from 1981 to 1984, over 150 people disappeared, including one American priest, Father James Carney, whose body has never been recovered."
Father Carney's death is one of thousands that have gone unsolved in Honduras, and the overwhelming majority of those victims were Hondurans. Hundreds more were disappeared, never to be seen again, alive or dead. The country has never recovered from this dirty war and what the US did in Honduras. Just as the worst of the bloodshed was letting up a decade later, US neoliberal economic policy ravaged the country and made it one huge maquiladora for major corporations.
The president of Honduras says he's the victim of a coup. He says he was brutally kidnapped by soldiers. His private secretary says Zelaya was taken into military custody at his house outside the capital. He was then whisked away to an Air Force base in the outskirts of the city.
During the Obama administration, a military coup overthrew the democratically elected leftist government of Manuel Zelaya, and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton supported the coup, even bragging that she had devised a way to resolve the crisis that would ensure that the elected president would never return to his post.
Now, I didn't like the way it looked or the way they did it, but they had a very strong argument that they had followed the Constitution and the legal precedents.
I bring this up because we need to understand that this situation was not created by Trump. It was created by more than a quarter of a century of US policy. Trump is the thug who stepped in late in the game and has continued decades of brutal, murderous, inhumane US policy and is now further punishing its victims.
So how did you feel when you saw the images of the women and children running from the tear gas?
Well, I do say, why are they there? I mean, I have to start off. First of all, the tear gas is a very minor form of the tear gas itself. It's very safe.
Today, Honduras is governed by a US-backed undemocratic leader. Crime and corruption are rampant. Gangs run murderous operations, and poverty is widespread. Remember all of this history when you listen to Donald Trump's racist and xenophobic rhetoric. Remember that the US played a central role over the course of decades in creating the conditions that have caused these desperate people, these families with their children, to flee. Remember this as you watch women and children gassed by US forces. History matters. Context matters.
So sometimes the links between these things can get blurred. What exactly is the connection between US support for the military regime and the dirty wars conducted during that time and the refugee crisis of today? Well, the link has to do with the environment of violence and the lawlessness of the state and the way that repression conditioned the state to behave in a way that resulted and produced more violence in society. And especially it has to do with the fact that since the military regime in Honduras, there has been no military reform and there has been no security or police reform. And so organizations that were conditioned and created and cultivated to use violence and repress and prop up a military regime were never really reformed. And the environment of violence and disorder that it created has persisted. And to this day, that environment has continued to support all sorts of criminal activity. And so in Central America, the United States did have a role in creating conditions that led to the refugee crisis. Let's take a look at some individual cases during the Cold War period and take a look at how the United States related to some of these countries and their specific concerns in each case. In the case of Guatemala, the United States was concerned primarily with the land reforms, land redistribution, and the expansion of labor rights of the Arbenz government, which was a sort of leftist, nationalist, reformist government. And Arbenz, in particular, sought to nationalize lands owned by the United Fruit Company. And this was a huge US multinational that had significantly invested in Guatemala. And so there was a lot at stake. The United States and the CIA in particular responded very aggressively. They began first with efforts to use diplomacy. When diplomacy didn't work, they tried to use regional pressures that could help to corner Guatemala and sort of subdue them and bring Arbenz to back off. When the regional diplomacy didn't work, the CIA supported a military coup in 1954, led by a Guatemalan general, Carlos Castillo Armas. This was an infamous coup because it was so obvious and so brazen. And the economic interest of the United Fruit Company was understood to be the key primal cause of the coup in the choice of the CIA to intervene. The case of Guatemala is one example, but it's very similar to other examples. Individual cases are all a little bit different. And so the example of Cuba is very different than the example of Guatemala. The example of Cuba stands out as well because of the survival of communism in Cuba, despite the efforts of the United States to combat communism there. And so the US-Cuban relationship goes back to really 1952, the Cold War relationship, that is. And in 1952, Fulgencio Batista carried out a coup. In July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro led a paramilitary assault seeking to overthrow the Batista government and establish one of his own. Castro was captured and exiled to Mexico, obviously did not succeed, but he, in short order, returned and planned another assault. He was defeated in December 1956. By 1958, Castro's M26 group had grown and expanded considerably. He'd been training revolutionaries and trying to put together a movement that could successfully overthrow the regime and establish a communist government. In January 1959, Castro successfully did precisely that, and his forces took power. Now, all of this is obviously terrifying to the United States because Cuba is not just very, very close to Florida. It's also a good example or a good sort of clarion call, so to speak. It could be a bellwether for what happens in the rest of the region at the time because of this sort of lurking potential for the countries of Latin America to become communist. And so the Cuban Revolution, as this was, really inspired a sense of urgency for the United States. They become especially concerned about the diffusion of the Cuban model. The US begins to exert significant pressure and is trying to maneuver and corner Castro and bring about a change through any means that could prevent the deepening of this revolution that had already taken hold. Castro looks to other sources of power and is capable of sort of eschewing US influence. This story of the US and Cuba goes on, and it begins to incorporate new actors. President Eisenhower plans Castro's overthrow, and this would be what would eventually be called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The idea was that US forces would train Cuban exiles to invade Cuba from its southern coast. And this was to take place in April 1961. Castro's forces were well prepared to defeat the invaders and defend their dignity, so to speak. The US does not provide support to the Cuban exiles. They're intent on simply coordinating the effort of the exiles. The counter-revolutionaries, however, are taken hostage. In the absence of US support means the failure of these Cuban exiled counter-revolutionaries. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion becomes a sort of iconic example of the durability of Castro and how slippery Castro became as this new revolutionary leader in Cuba, which itself became an example of what could happen in Latin America if the United States wasn't careful. The implications of all of this are enormous. So Castro increases his popularity, and the geopolitical implication is obvious as well. Castro and Cuba are pushed to the Soviet camp. What's interesting is that it wasn't even actually until the failed Bay of Pigs invasion that Castro and his camp aligned with the Soviets. The extreme response of the United States and the failure of the effort sort of led them in that direction and shaped their orientation more than anything. And so one of the ironies of the Bay of Pigs invasion is that the effort itself sort of was what inspired Castro and Cuba to eventually move closer to the Soviets. That's really one of the great ironies of the historical relationship between Cuba and the United States. And so the Bay of Pigs invasion was a flashpoint in the relationship, but it was also one that highlighted the potential for Latin America to go the other direction and for it to embrace the communism that the United States really, really feared above all. And so in this newspaper from, I'm forgetting what year this is from, this is a Daily News headline. It says, Kennedy takes the gloves off. And he said in that time, we do not intend to be lectured on intervention by those whose character was stamped for all time on the bloody streets of Budapest. It is not the first time communist tanks have rolled over gallant men and women. Cuba must not be abandoned to the communists, and we do not intend to abandon it. I am determined upon our system's survival and success, regardless of the cost and regardless of the peril. This is Castro and some of his comrades at the time during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, Cuba was a complicated case because there was a variety of different efforts made by the United States to try to prevent another Cuba and to ultimately save Latin America. So the Alliance for Progress was what became the new objective of the United States and the new vehicle for preventing a sort of slide into communism. The objective was economic development and inter-American cooperation to avoid another Cuba. But the Cuban Missile Crisis sort of intervened and intercepted and sort of interrupted this Alliance for Progress. And the Cuban Missile Crisis became sort of like the last big episode of contention between the United States and Cuba. And this came in 1962 when Castro allowed the USSR to install medium-range missiles in Cuba. The US, of course, already at odds with the Soviet Union, this is how they got in the situation in the first place, responded with a naval blockade. And the tense period of nuclear confrontation that resulted between the US and the Soviet Union nearly resulted in nuclear annihilation. It was very, very close, but ultimately disaster was averted. Castro, however, remained in power despite the resolution of the crisis. And to this day, Cuba remains under the control of the Communist Party. It is the communist dictatorship. And we'll now go to the rest of the video that we began on Monday, and we'll find out the rest of the story of the relationship between the US and Cuba.
With an uprising against Cuba's government. Under US law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality. And over the next 20 years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the US. That changes in 1952, when a former president and military leader named Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a coup, suspends the Constitution, and imposes an increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins the next year, led by a young Fidel Castro. American politics at this point is obsessed with fears of communism, so the US backs Batista in the war, no matter how brutal he becomes. But for Americans, this feels like a front in the struggle against communism. But for Cubans, it feels like Batista is an extension of American imperialism, and the guerrilla war a continuation of their long fight for freedom. Now, the communists win in 1959 and Castro takes power. The US, fearing communism's expansion, sets up the embargo to strangle Cuba's economy, tries to assassinate Castro, and even in the disaster known as Bay of Pigs, sends in CIA-trained Cubans to try to take over the island. Castro turns to the Soviets for help, and in 1962 they nearly start World War III when the US blocks Soviet efforts to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The incident scares everyone enough that things settle into a tense but basically peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans are squeezed between the US embargo and Castro's dictatorship. In 1980, Castro tries to relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrive in Florida. No one realizes it at the time, but this adds a completely new dimension to the conflict. It's now also about the internal Cuban battle between Castro versus Cuban dissidents, which plays out through American politics. Now, this becomes really important in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapses, President Bill Clinton, seeing Cuba poses no threat, wants to end the conflict. But so does Castro, who can't count on Soviet aid anymore. But Cubans in America, who suffered terribly at Castro's hand, want to see him fall and push for keeping the embargo. In the middle of this fight, in 1996, Cuba shoots down 2 private planes chartered by Cuban-American activists. There's a big backlash in the US, and Clinton backs down. 20 years later, President Barack Obama tries again to end the conflict. By now, Americans don't really support the embargo. Lots of Cuban Americans are now economic migrants rather than political exiles, so they want openness. Fidel is getting old, and in 2008, hands power to his brother Raul, who knows the country needs to change. The US and Cuba start secret talks in 2013. The new Pope, Francis, helps negotiate. In 2014, they reveal their agreement to end the conflict, and the next year, Obama becomes the first president to visit since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. The US and Cuba have never really had normal relations until now, and that's crucial to understanding why it took so long for this to happen. So much has passed between the two countries over the past century, and the US has at times treated Cuba as more of a colony than it's a real country. It's a lot to get over, but it looks like they might both finally be ready.
Unfortunately, the situation between Cuba and the United States has not fully thawed, and the Trump administration kind of took us back. And the future of the relationship might be unclear, but it doesn't look like in the grand scheme of things, greater openness is inevitable. But the relationship is obviously complex and nuanced and goes back more than a century. But this is a nice video because it puts a lot of this in perspective, and it talks about those key issues, and it talks about how the present day is shaped by the historical relationship. So the failure of the Alliance for Progress, which was an effort to avoid another Cuba and prevent the rise of leftist parties, can be understood as a result of four different causes or factors. In the first place, it was based on assumptions from modernization theory about the stage theory of development of developing countries. A lot of those assumptions are flawed, and especially in the Latin American context, they don't often bear out. And so those flawed theoretical underpinnings didn't serve the theory well or the program well. Low levels of economic aid also prevented economic development that could have served the policy more effectively. There was a very poor understanding of the link between social change and political context, and especially in terms of the realities in Latin America and how the informal distribution of power can be so different from in the United States. We've talked about that in the past in class. And then finally, there was the assumption that change would lead to democratic politics. Authoritarian rule, it does coincide with socialism in Latin America to this day, and the continuation of the Cuban communist regime and the rise of a socialist authoritarian regime in Venezuela obviously signifies that the Alliance for Progress and what was intended to prevent that didn't really succeed ultimately. And so the US intervention in involvement in Latin America was ultimately unsuccessful from the point of view of preventing leftist parties and governments from taking power. Now, from the point of view of preventing communism, maybe it was successful, but the military regimes and the very merciless support of repression ultimately turned many Latin Americans against the United States and created a lot of grievances that are very well understood. The case of Chile is also an important example of the United States intervention in Latin America. It's well known that the United States supported a coup in 1973 after the election in 1971 of Salvador Allende, who represented a threat to U.S. interests because not just the extensive foreign direct investment of U.S. companies in Chile, but also because of the Allende administration's very serious intent on nationalizing most of the economy, which it had already begun doing. There was the very real possibility that the administration would expropriate large U.S.-owned assets owned by private U.S. citizens. And the very fact that democratic elections could produce a left-wing leader was also very, very startling for the CIA, because their idea was that democracy itself shouldn't produce this outcome. In fact, they, in a strange way, thought that the democracy was more likely to produce the continuation of the kinds of economies that they thought were favorable to U.S. interests. So in response to Chile, the United States pursued really a two-track policy. In the first place, they cut assistance to Chile except for military aid. And so the point was no assistance to Chile as long as you have a socialist government we will provide aid to the military, but that socialist government was basically in conflict with the military in Chile because Allende did not trust the military. He thought that they had it in for him. And so from the beginning, the United States was sort of meddling in a domestic conflict. And then the United States also covertly funded opposition groups and media and encouraged a coup. And so what eventually took place, the 1973 coup, was backed by the CIA. Now, it was absolutely the project of the Chilean military, but it enjoyed significant support and moral support from the CIA. And so it can be understood as partly a product of the influence of the United States. Now, this brings us to the contemporary period, where we see a number of differences, but we also see some similarities. And one of the biggest differences is that the Cold War era of sort of aggressive military intervention or sort of support for military rule and military coups, that's sort of gone by the wayside. And the United States is now much more supportive of democratization and economic reforms, although with a very important asterisk and a very important sort of qualification, and we'll see what that means. But the United States has increasingly supported democratization. The Bush administration, the Clinton administrations promoted democratization in Haiti. These governments also criticized authoritarian backsliding in Peru in 1992, in Guatemala in 1993. They opposed coup mongers in Peru in 1989, Venezuela in 1992, Paraguay in 1996. In 1989, the US invasion of Panama ousted dictator Manuel Noriega, and this led to the installation of a government which had been denied office through electoral fraud. But the US defended this decision on the grounds that it was a just cause in light of the brutality of the Noriega dictatorship. It was a brutal dictatorship, but what is remarkable is that the United States picks and chooses which dictatorships to overthrow and which ones not to based upon the relevant interests involved. And so US foreign policy, though it does seem to promote democratization, also is fundamentally concerned with US interests. And so where democratization and promotion of democratization can also serve US interests, democratization becomes an important foreign policy goal. Not so much where it's less important. But one thing is true, blatant support for military coups and military interventions in politics is much less common, and it's less permissible and less acceptable on an international level. The US in general has moved away from that and has sort of moved back towards what's more in line with the sort of good neighbor policy or the kind of friendly cooperative relationships. Of course, the relationships between leftist governments and the US government were very, very cold and oftentimes tense. Oftentimes they didn't communicate whatsoever, but the United States did not overthrow those governments like it did in, say, Chile in 1973 and in Guatemala in 1954. Of course, the ways that the United States promotes democratization have also changed as well. They're not supporting military coups. The 2009 coup in Honduras, the Zelaya coup, it is true that Hillary Clinton basically approved of that. She was the head of the State Department, but I think that it's true also that that wasn't a CIA or a State Department project. That was a decision that largely came from the Honduran political system. In that situation, the Supreme Court basically issued a ruling that Zelaya's administration or an effort that he was making was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court essentially sanctioned a military coup against Zelaya on the grounds that his public policy or his agenda was unconstitutional. That was disputed, and that was very controversial, whether or not it truly was. But the State Department and the US CIA didn't really engineer that coup. All indications are that that came from Honduras. even so, there are some similarities that might loom larger than the differences. And in a moment, we'll examine the case of U.S.-Venezuelan relations to see some of those similarities. But generally speaking, during the contemporary period, military coups, CIA support for coups and interventions have been replaced with diplomatic pressure, public pronouncements, economic sanctions, say, for example, against Venezuela, which we'll talk about in a moment. All of these are examples of ways that the US government has tried to undermine authoritarianism in Latin America. Several US agencies like the Agency for International Development have been involved in fostering democracy, again, often where it helps to serve US foreign policy interests. But one key difference being that there's been a move away from the heavy-handed tactics of the past. Now, some aspects have not changed. And I want to emphasize how the US-Venezuelan case shows that there's been a great deal of continuity, even as there's been some change. And so in 1992, the United States encouraged and supported a coup against Venezuela's freely elected government. That was Hugo Chavez. And this was the beginning of a long, frigid relationship between Chavez and the US. And to this day, the relationship between his successor and the US is tense, to say the very, very least. Now, this decision was reminiscent of similar choices to support coups in 1973 and 54 against Chile and Guatemala's democratically elected governments. We saw a moment ago that in those cases, CIA support for a coup was very apparent and was decisive. Now, in the early 2000s, the potential for a US military invasion was discussed openly in Venezuelan government circles. A full decade later, the issue hadn't gone away as a potential possibility. Elsewhere in Latin America, this was not being discussed. The Venezuelan case was an extreme case, but the fact that it was discussed at all was extraordinary. Fast forward to 2019, and the relationship remains very, very cold. In 2019, President Trump formally recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Now, if that sounds strange to you, it's because, well, Maduro is the president of Venezuela. He's a dictator, and he canceled the referendum and presided over the Supreme Court seizure of power from the parliament, but he is the president. And so recognizing Guaido as the president is a strange thing to do, given that that obviously creates a strange and awkward situation between the United States and the Maduro administration. Of course, most countries in Latin America and in Europe, including Spain, also recognize Guaido as the president. The backstory to this is that there's sort of a legal loophole or a basis in Venezuela for the declaration of being president of the president of the assembly if there's a grounds for questioning the integrity of the election of the elected president. And so that's basically a bastardization of the situation, but more or less there's a technical grounds for Guaido declaring himself president. Still, it's very disputed, and the fact that it's a dispute and a controversy means that foreign powers like the United States weighing in and calling Guaido the president is bound to complicate the relationship between Venezuela and the United States, which is exactly what has happened. So let's take a look at this situation, and maybe in a moment, we'll step back a moment and think about it from a different point of view.
We are following major developments in the growing political crisis in Venezuela. Its president severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. after President Trump backed an opposition leader who's claimed the presidency. The standoff comes amid rising violence. 7 people were killed yesterday during massive protests demanding President Nicolas Maduro step down. Security forces used tear gas and water cannons against the demonstrators. Major Garrett is at the White House with more on this developing story. Major, good morning to you.
Good morning. It has long been a priority of this White House and bipartisan voices in Congress to pressure Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to step down. Now the White House has formally backed opposition leader Juan Guaido. Now, bloodshed and violence, repression already exist in Venezuela, but this move carries the risk of still more. Now, sources tell CBS News Guaido swore himself in as interim president yesterday and is now in hiding in the capital city of Caracas. The 35-year-old Guaido is head of the National Assembly, regarded by most international observers as the last remaining democratic institution in the country. Now, the U.S. and most world powers see Maduro as a dictator and regard his recent re-election nothing more than a sham. To ramp up pressure, the administration is considering sanctioning Venezuela's lucrative oil exports. Maduro still has major backers on the world stage, namely China and Russia. It is unclear how deep his support runs among Venezuela's military or federal police. Venezuela is in the midst of a massive humanitarian crisis, the worst by far in the hemisphere. Food and medicine are scarce, and violence on the streets rampant. Now, Maduro says the U.S. has 72 hours to remove its embassy personnel. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, because the United States does not recognize Maduro as legitimate, that order will be ignored. The president said in 2017, 2018, and again yesterday, all options are on the table to support the opposition. John?
All right, Major, thank you. So in fact, inflation in Venezuela up 1,000,000%.
Hi.
Money, paper, just worthless.
It's a huge story.
Yeah.
It's a huge story. We'll continue to cover it.
So the situation in Venezuela is obviously of crisis level proportions and much more than that. But the involvement of the U.S. seems to complicate the situation. And it seems clear that the tension in Venezuela and the conflict between Guaido and Maduro and the opposition and the regime has really worsened as a result of U.S. involvement and supporting Guaido and driving that further wedge between the two camps. So the resolution of the conflict within the country seems to be still more elusive as a result of U.S. involvement. Of course, the United States is only one among many countries who have sort of taken a position on this. And the situation in Venezuela is so dire that there is a need to consider some course of action. But it does raise the question of how much has really changed about U.S. Latin American relations, and kind of using Venezuela as an example or as like a microcosm of what is taking place between the United States and Latin America. We can ask, how much have U.S. Latin American relations changed? How much have they stayed the same? On the whole, have they changed in a qualitative way? Or has U.S. imperialism of old been replaced with a new form of imperialism? And I'd be curious what some of you think and what your perspective is.
Well, obviously, as I think has been demonstrated through successive recent governments, the ability to stage formal coups and support interventions in countries has become significantly more difficult. However, I still think there's a lack of deference to the voters and the people of Latin America, and sort of trying to primarily protect American interests before anything else.
Yeah, another example comes from Bolivia, where so the situation in Bolivia is difficult and controversial. On the one hand, there seems to be evidence that former President Evo Morales, who himself was a socialist as well, rigged elections and was able to win re-election as a result of basically fraudulent elections. On the other hand, there's also a compelling case that maybe the interpretation of the elections has been marred by political bias. The United States has opposed Evo Morales, and the relationship with Evo Morales has been more cooperative than was the relationship with Chavez and Maduro, but they've also opposed Evo Morales. And I think that, to Ishan's point, the disregard for the choices of Latin American societies and who they choose to vote for is palpable. There seems to be such an obvious support for who is best for U.S. foreign policy interests that they just have a disregard for the will of Latin American publics. And so in Bolivia, it seems like the response to Evo Morales' continued reelection was often colored by this view of him as this scary socialist, when in reality, he may have been winning those elections. Now, another perspective is that he might not have been winning, and maybe he was in power fraudulently, but that's a separate issue. To Ishan's point, this sort of continued focus on US interests at the expense of democratic outcomes seems obvious. And maybe from this perspective, not much has changed in Latin America. It's obviously less acceptable to support military coups, right? But we saw in the video how Hillary Clinton seemed totally fine with supporting the activities of the Honduran military when they carried out a coup against Zelaya. Of course, that was legitimated by the Supreme Court in Honduras, as I mentioned. And so in that regard, it was sort of legal and it was kind of justified. And that made it possible for Hillary Clinton to say that. But there does appear to be this continued focus primarily on US foreign policy interests. After all, Zelaya himself was a leftist who was trying to make economic policy reforms that could have been harmful to US investors in the region. US investors had especially invested since the establishment of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay, everybody, this was a good discussion, and I think that we got to the bottom of it. This is it. You know, we're now done, and I just want to thank you again for being here and being a part of this. I'll miss you all. I hope that we have classes again together and that you continue to study Latin America. It's the best region in the world, and it always will be. So thanks so much for sharing this passion with me, and I learned a great deal from you, and I'll always remember what we did together. So thanks so much. Have a great night, and just reach out to me and interact with me if you have questions or want some help. But otherwise, I will post everything according to schedule, and we'll wrap it up. All right. Thanks, everybody. That's a wrap. We'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.